Carl Jung once said, that the greatest danger for certain people does not lie in their weakness, but in their unusual strength, the strength of perception so refined that it sees what others cannot and therefore invites both awe and rejection. The story begins not with madness, but with clarity so sharp it cuts its bearer off from the world. Imagine being able to walk into any gathering, and immediately sense which smile is false, who carries unspoken grief, which conversation is nothing but performance. Most people pass through life noticing only the surface, distracted by appearances, reassured by social masks, yet there are individuals who cannot help but see through those masks as if they were thin veils. Jung, in his early clinical years, observed such patients, and noted with some alarm that these were not delusional individuals, but unusually gifted perceivers. He described their perception as differentiated, meaning it had become precise, and penetrating rather than diffuse. Yet what appeared like a gift also revealed itself as a curse, because the more they saw, the less they could belong. One of Jung's most memorable cases was a woman he treated around 1913, at a time when he himself was undergoing the rupture with Freud, and navigating the crisis that would later produce his Red Book. She was introverted, intuitive, and hypersensitive to atmospheres. Step into a room, and she instantly identified the simmering conflicts no one dared mention, the jealousy hidden beneath politeness, the repressed anger disguised as laughter. On paper this might sound like the description of an excellent psychologist, but in practice it was devastating. She could not maintain light conversation, because small talk was unbearable when she felt the tension underneath. She could not stay long in jobs, because her very presence disturbed the fragile agreements that allow groups to function smoothly. Even friendships dissolved because people felt naked around her, exposed in ways they never consented to. Jung came to realize he was not treating a pathology. This was not paranoia, nor hallucination, nor neurosis. This was consciousness that had become too conscious, perception pushed beyond the threshold of what is socially tolerable. In our modern context, we might call it hyperempathy or extreme sensitivity, but Jung saw it as something deeper, the unconscious of others flooding into one's awareness. This is why he called the discovery dangerous. Not dangerous for society although it unsettled others, but dangerous for the bearer, who lived in a constant state of psychic exposure. To appreciate why this matters, think of the role of social blindness in ordinary life. Most relationships survive because we politely ignore small tensions, allow minor dishonesty, or play along with illusions that keep things comfortable. The workplace functions because employees agree, tacitly, to overlook each other's frustrations, and keep the machinery moving. Families stay intact because secrets remain unspoken. Now, imagine being the one who cannot ignore those undercurrents, who notices the discomfort in someone's posture, the bitterness tucked inside a compliment, the suppressed envy at a sibling's success. Such awareness does not win you friends. It alienates you. People begin to suspect you of inventing negativity, when in fact you are merely reporting the signals they themselves are unconsciously sending. Jung's patient lived in this tension daily, and Jung himself felt echoes of it in his own life, perceiving archetypal movements in society that others did not see. In this sense, the clinical case mirrored his personal struggle. How does one live with vision that isolates? I find this deeply relevant today, because we live in a culture that simultaneously glorifies and punishes sensitivity. Social media encourages us to read the room and be emotionally intelligent, yet those who truly perceive beneath the surface often get branded as overthinkers, conspiracy-minded, or draining. There is a hidden contradiction. We admire empathy in theory, but in practice, too much empathy makes people uncomfortable. If you are the one who notices subtle lies or feels the sorrow behind someone's forced cheer, your observations are rarely welcomed. You become the difficult person, the one who brings down the mood. Jung's insight helps us understand this as a structural problem, not a personal failing. It is the nature of collective life to rely on a certain level of shared blindness, and when someone pierces that blindness, they threaten the fragile balance. This danger is not unique to Jung's time. Consider whistleblowers in politics or corporations. Their role is essentially to perceive what others pretend not to notice. They see corruption, hypocrisy, exploitation, and they name it. And what happens? More often than not, they are punished, ostracized, discredited. The truth is too disruptive. Jung's patient was not leaking documents, but leaking unconscious content, yet the social reaction was identical: hostility toward the revealer rather than toward the reality revealed. This suggests a timeless pattern. Human groups protect themselves not by confronting uncomfortable truths, but by silencing those who expose them. Thus, the danger of perception is not merely psychological, it is existential. It threatens belonging, survival, and identity. From a personal standpoint, I think of individuals I've known who could instantly sense the vibe of a space. They pick up when a couple is on the brink of divorce before either partner admits it, or they notice when a coworker is hiding despair under a cheerful facade. These people are often exhausted because their nervous system is constantly processing signals others ignore. They live on high alert. And unless they learn strategies of containment, their gift turns into burnout. Jung's recognition that this is not illness, but a kind of advanced consciousness reframes the problem. These individuals do not need to be fixed, they need to be supported, trained, and guided toward integration. At the same time, one must also admit the risk of distortion. Not every perception is accurate. The intuitive person may sometimes project their own material onto others, confusing personal anxiety with external truth. Jung was keenly aware of this. That is why he distinguished between pathological paranoia, where one's projections dominate, and differentiated perception, where observations could be verified. In his patient's case, he carefully cross-checked her impressions, and found them remarkably accurate. This accuracy is what made it both impressive and unbearable. Imagine having a built-in lie detector you cannot switch off, and then being forced to socialize with people who rely on white lies to function. It is little wonder such individuals withdraw into solitude. Yet Jung's brilliance was not merely in noticing this pattern, but in naming it as dangerous. He understood that society needs both blindness and vision, denial and truth. Too much blindness, and corruption spreads unchecked; too much vision, and human bonds disintegrate. The perceiver's danger is being trapped between these extremes. Jung would later argue that integration, the ability to hold perception without being consumed by it, was essential. But at the moment of discovery, with his patient, he was confronting raw perception without integration, and it shook him. He saw not only her suffering, but the possibility of his own. For Jung himself was a perceiver, haunted by dreams, symbols, and archetypal visions that few around him could comprehend. His clinical notes about the dangerous discovery were also reflections on his personal battle with being too awake in a world that prefers to sleepwalk. So what does this mean for us? It means that the story of differentiated perception is not just a medical curiosity, but a mirror of cultural dynamics. It forces us to ask, how do we treat those who perceive more deeply than we do? Do we exile them as misfits, medicate them into numbness, or can we find ways to harness their vision constructively? I believe our era desperately needs such visionaries, especially when global crises from climate change to social injustice depend on noticing patterns others would rather ignore. Jung's patient, though tragic in her isolation, also represents a prototype, the person whose nervous system is tuned to the hidden frequencies of collective life. Whether this becomes a burden or a contribution depends on integration, community, and cultural readiness. Without those, the perceiver collapses under the weight of their own awareness. With them, they may become guides, healers, and cultural pioneers. In conclusion, part 1 of this exploration shows us that perception, when too sharp, destabilizes ordinary life. It reveals that Jung's most dangerous discovery was not a disorder, but a mirror reflecting the tension between individual clarity and collective denial. To see everything is not to be blessed with power, it is to be burdened with isolation, unless one learns to transform vision into wisdom. The story of Jung's patient is a cautionary tale, but also a beacon. It warns us that truth without containment destroys, but truth with integration transforms. And that is the challenge we carry forward, to honor perception without allowing it to consume us, and to recognize that those who see too much are not broken, they are simply ahead of their time, walking a path that most of us have yet to notice. To understand why Jung called this discovery dangerous, we must explore the paradox at its heart. Perception, the very faculty that should help us orient in the world, can also turn against us when it becomes too differentiated. Normally, perception is a tool of adaptation. We notice enough to survive, to find food, to avoid threats, to navigate social life. But Jung noticed that some people cross an invisible line. They no longer see merely enough, they see too much. And this surplus of awareness becomes destabilizing, not because reality itself has changed, but because their relation to reality has. Imagine walking through life as though every surface were made of glass. You see the hidden mechanisms of behavior, the unconscious motives, the unspoken dynamics. At first this seems like a superpower, yet the longer it persists, the more alien it makes you feel, because society is not designed for transparency. Society runs on shared illusions, on tacit agreements not to probe too deeply. Those who pierce those illusions become outsiders. Jung came to believe that this paradox where clarity becomes confusion, and insight becomes alienation was at the root of many breakdowns he witnessed. Let us take an example. Consider the archetype of the trickster, which Jung studied extensively. The trickster exposes the hidden flaws of society, often through humor, inversion, or exaggeration. He reveals hypocrisy, punctures pride, mocks false authority. Yet tricksters are rarely loved by the communities they expose. They are tolerated at best, scapegoated at worst. In myth, they are often punished, exiled, or transformed into cautionary figures. Jung's sensitive patients, including the woman with hyperperception, often embodied something of the trickster unwillingly. Their very presence revealed what others wanted to hide, and in doing so, they disrupted the group's fragile balance. The paradox is that they were not wrong. They were accurate. But accuracy itself became their crime. In Jung's terms, they were suffering from an overactivation of consciousness, a condition in which the unconscious contents of others spilled into their field of perception, forcing them into roles they never chose. Now, why does this happen? Jung believed the psyche operates as a balancing system. Most people live with a protective filter, a kind of psychic membrane that shields them from being overwhelmed. But in certain individuals that membrane becomes too thin, either through trauma, inherited sensitivity, or the eruption of unconscious material. When that happens, perception is no longer filtered. Archetypes, symbols, emotions, and collective forces rush in. To the outside world, it looks like the person is imagining things or making drama, but Jung insisted that they are perceiving real psychic facts, just not facts everyone is prepared to see. This makes their position tragic. They cannot deny what they perceive, yet no one validates it. The paradox is sharpened. Truth without witness feels like madness. Jung himself lived this paradox most intensely between 1913 and 1917, during what he later described as his confrontation with the unconscious. After the break with Freud, Jung plunged into a period of visions, dreams, and symbolic encounters that terrified him. He feared he was losing his mind. But instead of resisting, he surrendered to the images, recording them in what became the Red Book. There he wrestled with archetypal figures Elijah, Salome, Philemon, who taught him the necessity of integrating unconscious contents into conscious life. In hindsight, Jung recognized that his patients with extreme perception were undergoing similar struggles, except without the tools he eventually forged. They were living out what he called the individuation process prematurely, exposed to unconscious material without preparation. This premature exposure could indeed look like psychosis, yet it was not mere illness. It was the psyche's attempt to expand consciousness, though at great personal cost. Here lies the paradox again: what looks like breakdown may actually be breakthrough, but only if the individual can contain the flood of perception, and shape it into meaning. If containment fails, the same perceptions that could have become wisdom dissolve into torment. Jung used the image of alchemy to describe this. The raw substance, the prima materia, must undergo a series of transformations in the vessel. If the vessel breaks, the energy escapes chaotically, and nothing is integrated. The person burns in their own fire. But if the vessel holds, the fire transforms the substance into gold. Differentiated perception is precisely such a fire. For some it destroys, for others it illuminates. The danger lies not in perception itself, but in the lack of containment. When I reflect on this, I think of modern parallels. Highly perceptive individuals today often gravitate toward creative or spiritual paths, because ordinary professions feel suffocating. Artists, writers, therapists, activists, these are roles where deep perception can be channeled constructively. But those who lack outlets often implode. We see it in gifted children labeled as too sensitive, in empaths overwhelmed by global suffering, in creatives who self-medicate to numb their visions. The paradox of seeing too much persists. Society calls them maladjusted, but perhaps they are maladjusted to illusions, not to reality. Jung would argue that their suffering is not meaningless, but points toward a larger transformation the culture itself resists. To illustrate, let us consider another clinical case Jung described. A young man arrived at his clinic after experiencing visions of a cosmic battle. Doctors were ready to diagnose schizophrenia. But Jung noticed the imagery was not random, it mirrored ancient myths of Ragnarok, the apocalyptic struggle in Norse mythology. Rather than dismissing the visions, Jung asked, why would the unconscious choose the symbol? What does it mean that a modern European sees a myth thousands of years old unfolding inside him? Jung concluded that the man's perception had tuned into archetypal content, the collective unconscious speaking in symbols. This was not mere psychosis, it was an eruption of myth into modern life. The paradox again, a breakdown outwardly, but potentially a breakthrough inwardly, if the images could be integrated. What makes this dangerous, of course, is that society rarely provides the vessel. Ancient cultures had shamans, initiatory rituals, mythic frameworks to help people channel overwhelming perceptions. Modern culture offers diagnosis, medication, and marginalization. Jung criticized this reduction, insisting that some patients were not sick, but undergoing spiritual crises mislabeled as illness. Without guidance, however, these crises did lead to collapse. Thus the danger was twofold: the danger of being crushed by perception, and the danger of being crushed by a society that refuses to understand perception's depth. One might ask, why not simply turn it off? Why not numb perception, retreat into distraction, ignore the undercurrents? Jung would respond that one cannot truly unsee what one has seen. Once consciousness expands, it does not shrink back. The only way forward is through integration, not regression. This is why he spoke of individuation as a lifelong process. Perception must be balanced by grounding, vision by embodiment, insight by humility. Without this balance, the perceiver burns out. With it, they become what Jung called the wounded healers, someone whose suffering equips them to guide others. Personally, I find this paradox haunting because it resonates with so many real stories. The artist tormented by visions that later become masterpieces. The activist ostracized for naming injustices that later history confirms. The therapist who carries others' pain because she cannot turn away from suffering she perceives. Each embodies the same dynamic: perception as both gift and curse, clarity as both illumination and burden. Jung's warning about the most dangerous discovery was not to frighten us away from perception, but to remind us of its weight. If we wish to see deeply, we must be prepared for the consequences. In sum, Part 2 shows us that the paradox of seeing too much lies at the intersection of consciousness, and culture. The perceiver is torn between breakthrough and breakdown, between illumination and alienation. Jung recognized that what looks like madness may actually be the psyche's attempt to enlarge itself, but without containment, it turns destructive. The challenge, then, is not to suppress perception, but to build vessels strong enough to hold it. This is the paradox: the very thing that isolates us can also transform us, but only if we endure the fire without shattering. When Jung spoke of differentiated perception as dangerous, he was not only referring to the ability to see into the psyche of an individual. He was also speaking of something far larger, something he called the collective unconscious. To grasp the danger fully, we must step beyond the personal into the transpersonal. For if perceiving too much about one person can destabilize you, perceiving too much about the hidden structures of humanity itself can shatter you completely. The collective unconscious, as Jung defined it, is the deep layer of the psyche shared by all human beings. It is not personal memory, not the sum of your childhood experiences. It is the inherited pattern of human existence itself, the great riverbed through which myths, archetypes, and symbols flow. Jung argued that beneath our individual minds lies a shared matrix that shapes how we dream, how we imagine gods, how we fear monsters, how we tell stories. This is why cultures separated by oceans produce myths with striking similarities. The Great Mother, the hero, the trickster, the shadow, these archetypal figures appear everywhere, because they are not invented by cultures, but discovered within the psyche. Now, imagine what happens when perception becomes so sharpened, so differentiated, that it pierces through personal layers into this collective domain. Suddenly you are not merely seeing your neighbor's complexes or your partner's defenses. You are seeing the archetypal drama beneath them, the ancient myth playing itself out through modern faces. Jung's patients who crossed this threshold often described experiences of cosmic battles, divine presences, or apocalyptic visions. To a psychiatrist trained only in materialist models, these were delusions. To Jung, they were encounters with the collective unconscious. But here lies the peril: archetypes are not tame. They are vast, impersonal forces. To come too close to them without preparation is like touching raw electricity. In normal life, archetypes operate invisibly. You fall in love, and the archetype of anima or animus colors your perception. You face an obstacle, and the hero archetype urges you forward. You betray someone, and the trickster laughs through your action. All of this happens unconsciously, smoothly, without overwhelming you. But when archetypes break into consciousness too strongly, they no longer appear as subtle moods or symbolic dreams. They appear as overwhelming presences, visions, obsessions. The psyche loses balance. The ego feels invaded. Jung warned that this invasion is the true danger of perception, not seeing too much of reality, but seeing too much of the archetypal reality that undergirds it. To illustrate, consider Jung's own terrifying vision in 1913, just before the outbreak of World War I. While traveling on a train through Europe, Jung suddenly saw rivers of blood flooding the continent. He felt it not as a private fantasy, but as a prophecy. Weeks later, the Great War erupted, confirming his dread. Jung realized that his vision was not merely personal anxiety, it was the collective unconscious revealing itself through him. He had perceived an archetypal image of destruction that humanity was about to enact. This experience convinced him that individuals sometimes carry visions on behalf of the collective, and that differentiated perception can expose you to truths too heavy for one psyche to bear. This is why Jung often emphasized humility. To perceive archetypes is to brush against gods. You cannot master them, only relate to them. Those who mistake archetypal perception for personal grandeur fall into inflation, believing themselves to be chosen, messianic, omniscient. Jung saw this often in psychotic patients who believed they were Christ, or that they held cosmic secrets. He did not mock them. He recognized that they had indeed encountered archetypal material, but without grounding, the experience had swept them into delusion. The danger of differentiated perception is not only alienation, but inflation, the ego overwhelmed by the weight of myth. Think of it this way, the archetypes are like tectonic plates beneath the psyche. Most of the time we walk on the surface, feeling only minor tremors. But differentiated perception drops you into the fault line. You feel the full grinding force of myth beneath history. To survive that plunge requires extraordinary resilience. Without it, you are crushed. What does this mean for ordinary life? It means that those who perceive deeply are not just sensitive to people, they are sensitive to history itself, to culture, to the zeitgeist. They intuit the collective moods before they erupt. They sense when societies are lying to themselves, when civilizations are nearing crisis. This can make them prophetic in one sense, but unbearable in another, because who wants to hear the truth before it arrives? Who wants to look into the shadow of a nation before it manifests in war or collapse? Jung knew this intimately. His visions were dismissed by colleagues, yet history vindicated him. The danger of perception, then, is being condemned in the present for truths that only the future will confirm. This brings us to Jung's concept of the shadow. The shadow is the repressed, unwanted side of the psyche. Individually, it is everything about ourselves we refuse to acknowledge: jealousy, rage, lust, fear. Collectively, it is everything societies refuse to acknowledge: oppression, greed, violence, denial. Differentiated perception exposes the shadow mercilessly. You see the envy in your friend's smile, the fear in your leader's speech, the rot in your culture's ideals. At first, this seems like clarity. But too much shadow perception isolates you. People do not like mirrors that reveal their blemishes. They shun the one who sees. Thus the perceiver becomes lonely, even persecuted, for carrying truths others will not face. Jung believed this confrontation with shadow was unavoidable for individuation, the process of becoming whole. To grow, one must integrate the shadow, both personal and collective. But integration requires courage, because the shadow is not abstract. It bleeds into dreams, erupts in projections, demands acknowledgement of one's own complicity. Differentiated perception makes denial impossible. Once you see your own cruelty, your own pettiness, your own hypocrisy, you cannot go back to the comfort of ignorance. Likewise, once you see the shadow of your culture, the lies it tells, the violence it hides, you are forever changed. This is why Jung warned that perception is dangerous, it demands responsibility. To see is to be accountable. We might think here of whistleblowers, truth-tellers, prophets, all those who expose shadows larger than themselves. They rarely live easy lives. They are exiled, discredited, sometimes destroyed. But history often later recognizes them as seers. The paradox recurs, perception as both curse and contribution. The individual suffers, but humanity evolves. Jung believed that differentiated perception served a purpose, not for the individual alone, but for the collective. Those who see too much carry what the culture cannot yet bear, planting seeds for a future consciousness. From a psychological standpoint, this frames perception not as a private gift, but as a collective burden. The psyche, Jung argued, is self-regulating. When a society denies too much shadow, it will force individuals to carry the denial as symptoms, visions, or breakdowns. In this sense, the woman with hyperperception, or Jung himself with his visions, were not merely unfortunate anomalies. They were the culture's unconscious forcing itself into visibility through them. Differentiated perception thus becomes not just a personal fate, but a collective necessity. And yet, here lies the deepest danger. If society refuses the message, the individual carrier is left to drown. Without recognition, without ritual, without support, the perceiver becomes isolated, crushed by archetypal weight. This is why Jung insisted on the importance of symbolic frameworks: myth, religion, art as vessels for perception. Symbols provide form. They translate raw archetypes into images the ego can work with. Without symbols, perception is too direct, too overwhelming. With symbols, perception becomes transformative. The difference between madness and myth, Jung suggested, is not content, but context. So, the collective unconscious and archetypes magnify the stakes of perception. To differentiate perception too far is to risk being overtaken by forces older and larger than oneself. To resist them is impossible. To integrate them requires strength few possess. This is why Jung called it dangerous. It is not only about knowing more, it is about bearing more than one life can carry. In closing, Part 3 reveals that perception becomes truly perilous when it pierces into the collective layers of psyche. Archetypes, shadows, and mythic dramas flood the individual, blurring the line between personal and transpersonal. To see these forces clearly is to stand in a storm of history and myth. Jung believed some must endure this storm, for the sake of culture itself, but he never minimized the cost. Differentiated perception, at this depth, is no longer just psychology. It is destiny. Carl Jung once remarked, "The psyche is not subject to human categories of true and false, but to the categories of meaningful and meaningless." That sentence alone reveals how radically he diverged from a purely rationalist worldview. For most of modern thought, perception is about accuracy. Did you see the facts correctly? Did your vision align with external reality? But for Jung, the real measure of perception was not factual correctness, but existential depth. Does what you perceive matter? Does it shake your soul? Does it carry weight? That kind of perception is not neutral, it is numinous. The word numinous comes from the Latin numen, meaning divine presence, the awe-inspiring, the uncanny. It is what Rudolf Otto, a theologian whom Jung admired, called the mysterium tremendum et fascinans, the mystery that both terrifies and fascinates. To encounter the numinous is to stand before something that overwhelms the ego, that dwarfs human categories. It is not merely strange, it is holy, dreadful, magnetic. Jung recognized that differentiated perception often brings one face to face with this quality of experience. When the unconscious erupts, when archetypes manifest, when the veil of rationality tears, what stands revealed is not just more reality, but more mystery. This is precisely where danger lies. For to see too much is not only to know more facts. It is to feel the pulse of something greater than knowledge, something irrational, inexhaustible, alive. Jung described this as the experience of God images, symbols that embody the infinite. Whether in dreams, visions, or synchronistic events, the psyche produces images that point beyond the ego's comprehension. Differentiated perception means noticing these images, and recognizing their weight. But what happens when reason resists? When the ego insists on control? Then the perceiver is torn between two worlds, the rational framework of society, and the numinous flood of the psyche. Let us pause on this conflict. Modernity is built on reason, on the Enlightenment ideal that everything can be measured, explained, reduced to science. Perception, in this model, is a matter of clarity, detachment, precision. But Jung dared to say, such perception is only half. The other half is irrational, symbolic, mythic. To perceive only rationally is to miss half of reality. Yet to perceive irrationally without grounding is madness. The tension is unbearable, yet unavoidable. Those who differentiate perception too far often find themselves exiled in this tension. They cannot return to the safety of mere rationality, but neither can they live entirely in myth. Consider Jung's patients who reported synchronistic experiences, moments when inner events mirrored outer events in uncanny ways. One woman dreamed of a golden scarab, and the next day, as she recounted the dream, a beetle resembling a scarab tapped against Jung's window. Coincidence? To a rationalist, yes. To Jung, it was synchronicity, a meaningful acausal connection. The danger of perception here lies in the willingness to entertain meaning beyond causality. If you accept it, you risk ridicule as superstitious. If you reject it, you risk missing the living mystery of psyche. The perceiver is caught between worlds, and both accuse him. Science calls him mystical, religion calls him unorthodox. The numinous, then, is not a concept, but an experience. People who perceive it often describe it in terms of awe, standing before a vast mountain range, gazing at the night sky, or feeling the uncanny timing of fate. Jung argued that such experiences are not luxuries or illusions, they are fundamental. They reveal that the psyche itself is religious in structure. Not religious in the sense of dogma, but in the sense that it spontaneously generates images of the sacred. Dreams of light, visions of unity, feelings of infinite presence, these are not imported from culture, but emerge from within. Differentiated perception simply makes one more susceptible to noticing them. But this susceptibility is dangerous, because modern society dismisses the numinous. The rationalist calls it fantasy. The materialist calls it hallucination. The fundamentalist calls it heresy. And yet, Jung insisted, the psyche will produce it regardless. To deny it is to repress it, and repressed numinosity does not vanish. It returns twisted, inflated, destructive. History shows this. When religious instinct is denied, it erupts as ideology, fanaticism, totalitarian cults. Jung, writing during the rise of Nazism, saw clearly how archetypal energies, repressed from conscious religion, had possessed a nation in political form. Differentiated perception sees this link, how the hunger for the sacred mutates into collective madness if ignored. But who wants to hear that? Who can bear to say that politics is religion in disguise? Here, then, perception is no longer personal, but civilizational. To perceive too deeply is to see that society itself is possessed by numinous forces masquerading under secular names. Consumerism, nationalism, scientism, each is a cult of sorts, complete with myths, rituals, and promises of salvation. The perceiver who points this out is rarely thanked. He is mocked, marginalized, or worse. Yet the danger is not only social, it is psychological. For once you see society's illusions, where do you belong? How do you live among myths you no longer believe, yet cannot escape? Jung believed the answer lay in symbolic life. Symbols, unlike dogmas, do not demand literal belief. They invite participation. A symbol points beyond itself while remaining finite. The cross, the mandala, the circle, these are not final answers, but bridges between ego and mystery. Differentiated perception transforms from dangerous to creative when it learns to live with symbols. To see a dream not as prophecy, but as symbol is to honor its meaning without collapsing into inflation. To see synchronicity not as proof, but as pointer is to honor mystery without abandoning reason. This balance is fragile, but it is the only way forward. Yet again, the difficulty is that modernity has lost the symbolic imagination. We interpret literally or we dismiss entirely. Dreams are just brain noise, or they are literal prophecies. Myths are just stories, or they are dogmatic truths. The middle path, seeing them as living symbols, is neglected. Differentiated perception, in Jung's sense, demands this middle path. It demands the courage to perceive more than reason allows, without surrendering to delusion. Few succeed. Many break. This is why Jung's psychology is not mere theory, but a practice of survival in the face of the numinous. Let us return to the danger itself. Imagine a person who suddenly perceives numinosity everywhere. Every coincidence feels charged. Every dream feels like revelation. Every encounter feels fated. At first, this is exhilarating. The world glows. But soon, it becomes unbearable. Meaning saturates everything, and the ego cannot hold it. Life becomes overwhelming, even paranoid. This is what Jung called being possessed by the unconscious. Differentiated perception, without grounding, leads here. The ego inflates or collapses under the flood of meaning. The task, then, is integration. To perceive deeply, but not drown. to accept mystery without surrendering discernment. Jung modeled this himself through his practice of active imagination, dialoguing with images, not denying them, but not confusing them with literal reality. He painted mandalas, wrote down visions, built symbolic structures like his tower at Bollingen. These were not eccentric hobbies, but survival strategies. They gave form to the numinous without reducing it. They allowed him to live with perception rather than be destroyed by it. And here lies a lesson for us: differentiated perception will always be dangerous, but it need not be fatal. It becomes survivable when expressed symbolically through art, ritual, myth, story. Without expression, perception curdles into madness. With expression, it becomes transformation. Jung believed that the future of humanity depended on this, learning to live symbolically again, to let perception expand without collapsing society into literalism or nihilism. In summary, Part 4 shows that perception, once differentiated, inevitably encounters the limits of reason. Beyond those limits lies the numinous, the overwhelming presence of the irrational, the symbolic, the divine. This encounter is both peril and promise. Peril, because the ego cannot master it. Promise, because it reconnects us with the depths of psyche and cosmos. Jung's warning remains: see too much, and you may lose yourself. Yet his invitation also remains: see deeply enough, and you may find not just yourself, but meaning itself. Carl Jung often said that the goal of life was not perfection, but wholeness. At first glance, this might sound comforting, a gentle call to embrace both your strengths and your flaws. But when you unfold what Jung actually meant, it is nothing short of terrifying. Because wholeness requires perceiving not just what is bright, noble, and admirable in the psyche, but also what is dark, shameful, destructive, and demonic. It means perceiving the full spectrum of human possibility, the entire psychic reality. And that perception is dangerous, because it strips away every illusion the ego clings to for safety. Most people, Jung believed, never approach wholeness. They remain trapped in partiality, living from the persona, the mask presented to society, while repressing the shadow. They perceive only what confirms their identity, their beliefs, their roles. This is safer. It avoids inner conflict. It avoids the dangerous confrontation with one's own darkness. But it also leaves life shallow, empty, haunted by the unlived. For Jung, the unlived life does not simply vanish. It waits in the unconscious, growing more hostile the longer it is ignored. Differentiated perception, the courage to see more, forces this confrontation. It demands that we see what we least want to see, the shadow. To see the shadow is to perceive your capacity for cruelty, cowardice, betrayal, lust, greed, pettiness. It is to admit that the evil you fear in the world also lives in you. Jung put it bluntly: the line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being. Differentiated perception makes this undeniable. And once you know it, you can no longer project evil entirely outward. You can no longer live in simple moral binaries. The world becomes more complex, more ambiguous. And you become more responsible. That responsibility is dangerous, because it demands humility. It collapses self-righteousness. It destabilizes identity. Small wonder most people flee from it. But perception does not stop at the shadow. It also opens to the anima, and animus, the contracte sexual archetypes that represent the inner opposite. For a man, this means perceiving the feminine within: sensitivity, vulnerability, receptivity. For a woman, it means perceiving the masculine within: assertiveness, logos, agency. To encounter these figures is again dangerous, because they destabilize the ego's gendered identity. They blur lines. They challenge stereotypes. They demand integration of qualities we may have denied or disowned. Once again, perception broadens reality, and once again, it threatens the stability of the self we thought we were. From there, perception moves toward the deepest archetype, the self. Unlike the ego, the self is not a part of consciousness. It is the totality of psyche, both conscious and unconscious. It often appears in symbols of wholeness, circles, mandalas, divine figures. To perceive the self is overwhelming, because it reveals that the ego is not the center. The little I that thought it ruled is dethroned. A larger principle, mysterious and autonomous, is glimpsed. This is what Jung meant when he said the self has numinous quality. It is experienced as godlike, yet it arises within. Differentiated perception, at its final stage, reveals this. And here lies the greatest danger: inflation. Inflation occurs when the ego identifies with the self. Instead of recognizing the self as a larger totality of which the ego is only a part, the ego claims divinity for itself. Mystics fall into this. Cult leaders fall into this. Visionaries who cannot distinguish between symbol and self fall into this. They believe they are gods, saviors, world historic geniuses. The danger of perception at this level is that the more you see, the more you risk believing you are the source of what you see. The ego, dazzled by archetypal light, mistakes itself for the sun. Jung saw this in patients, in history, and in himself. He warned, the closer you approach the self, the greater the danger of psychic inflation. The light that heals can also consume. So where does this leave us? Are we doomed either to blindness or madness? Jung's answer was individuation, the process of becoming whole. Not perfect, not divine, not flawless whole. Individuation means gradually differentiating perception, seeing more and more of psychic reality, but also integrating what is seen. It means not just glimpsing the shadow, but working with it. Not just meeting anima or animus, but balancing with them. Not just perceiving the self, but orienting to it humbly, symbolically. Individuation is not a single moment, but a lifelong dialogue with perception. Each new insight, each new symbol, must be assimilated into life. Otherwise, perception overwhelms. And here we see the paradox: perception is both gift and curse. Without it, we live shallowly, dominated by unconscious forces we refuse to see. With it, we risk being shattered by the immensity of psyche. Jung's entire psychology can be read as a set of tools for surviving perception: dream analysis, active imagination, symbolic thinking, mythic frameworks. These are not academic curiosities. They are survival strategies for those who see too much. Why is perception so central for Jung? Because reality itself is mediated through psyche. We do not encounter the world directly, we encounter it through images, symbols, archetypes. To purify perception, to differentiate it, is therefore to come closer to reality not as the ego defines it, but as the psyche lives it. Yet reality is not tame. It is not reducible to reason. It is infinite, terrifying, numinous. To see it clearly is to tremble. Thus perception is always dangerous, and yet it is the only path to wholeness. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of Jung's vision is that perception changes destiny. Once you have seen, you cannot unsee. Once you have glimpsed the shadow, or felt synchronicity, or encountered the numinous, you cannot return to naive rationalism. The world remains forever altered. You may try to deny it, to repress it, but it will gnaw at you. The responsibility of perception is irreversible. Jung wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." That sentence crystallizes the entire danger. Enlightenment is not bliss, but confrontation. To perceive truly is to suffer, but it is also to grow. In the end, Jung leaves us with no easy resolution. Differentiated perception is both the wound and the cure. It threatens the ego, but saves the soul. It destabilizes identity, but reveals wholeness. It brings madness closer, but also meaning. Perhaps the most honest conclusion is that perception is fate. Some are called to see more, and for them, life will never be safe. but it will be real. And perhaps that is enough. Carl Jung did not offer a map for comfort. He offered a map for survival in the wilderness of the psyche. At the heart of that map lies perception, not as passive reception of data, but as dangerous encounter with reality, both inner and outer. To perceive deeply is to risk everything, but it is also to step into the fullness of life. For Jung, that was the path of individuation. For us, it remains the challenge: dare we see?